This is a great question. The commenter asks, does stress include hyperarousal triggered by social interaction? Not because he feels threatened, just excited, but it takes 2 hours to be calm enough to enjoy himself. And this is a really excellent question because it can be a really confusing combination of emotion and stress and behavior for folks to grapple with. It's generally much easier for us as humans to understand when our dog is fearful or excited, and that leads to stress, higher stress levels, which can lead to reactive behaviors or aggressive behaviors or whatever the behavior concern is, extreme, like running away. That is usually easier for us to understand than when there are other emotions at play, particularly excitement or positive emotions. So when I talk with my clients about our stress scale, we have green, yellow, orange, and red. And what I explain is that in the green zone, we are regulated. We're in the thinking brain. We're experiencing a healthy level of stress. And you can experience negative emotions in the green zone. You can feel frustrated. You can feel angry. You can feel nervous. Emotions are separate from the stress scale. Emotions are not being measured on the stress scale. They matter. They're very important, but they're not being measured on our stress scale. So green zone, healthy level of stress. As we go up into that yellow zone, we may still be experiencing positive emotions, but think of it as the thinking brain and the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest, aren't working at full capacity. Imagine that they're working at like 80% capacity. And the limbic system, the sympathetic nervous system, is starting to take up those other 20% of resources, right? And in this stage, we can still be having positive emotions like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited that my friend is here. The goal is for the learner to calm down. The learner is trying to cope with stress. This is where we see displacement behaviors. They're trying to bring themselves back down. They may or may not have the skills that serve them in that attempt. We may see them engage in displacement behaviors that actually increase their arousal, but there is an attempt to cope with the stress here. When we move up from there into the orange zone, now imagine that things have shifted and we have, say, 80% of the resources in the body going to that sympathetic nervous system, that survival brain, and 20% of our resources, say, going to that thinking brain. So now the majority of resources are going to that survival brain. This is where we start to see that the learner is closer to fight or flight than they are to rest and digest. This is where we start to see physiological stress responses externally. So the dog is adrenalized and we see dilated pupils, panting from an elevated heart rate, those longer lips, tension ridges, and the dog isn't processing information very well, including like the body language or other communication of other beings. Verbal cues, smells, they're not processing super well. And by this point, even if we started out with a positive emotion, stress levels have increased to a point that our learner is no longer having fun. You can think of it as kind of like an overwhelm or an overstimulation, or sometimes we've gone from excited to frustrated, but this isn't big excitement. The dog is not having a good time. They're not experiencing healthy levels of stress. Their body is closer to reacting as if there's a threat than not, even if they didn't start out fearful or afraid of the trigger. And this is why you can see things like dogs playing really well together, and then the arousal goes up, and then it may turn into frustration, and a dog fight might even break out because we go from things being okay to things getting a little too intense. And of course, I'm oversimplifying how the brain and body work quite a bit and leaving out a lot of nuance. But we can certainly say that if we have a dog who is taking 2 hours to come down in a social interaction, to be relaxed enough to enjoy themselves, that is some very high stress, and that is lower resilience than we might expect. And so for 2 hours, our learner is experiencing unhealthy levels of stress and they are not having a positive interaction. And I would be wondering if the interactions that they are able to have when they are calmer are worth the trade-off of that. So I would definitely want to be focused on supporting the dog in going into those situations in a more green zone brain. And that's where we start doing the work of breaking down criteria more finely than one might think possible. With one of my clients, I would want to take a really holistic look at stress reduction and look beyond just sort of the specific stress around these social interactions. I'd want to take a really broad view at what's going on with the dog holistically, and then we would also work on building self-regulation skills, building resilience to stress, so that we're seeing those shift as well. And then depending on what's going on with the individual dog, if the dog isn't experiencing negative emotions initially, hyperarousal is exactly the word, right? Hyperarousal in dysregulated dogs is referring to dogs who baseline higher on that stress scale, just like you might see in a dog with an anxiety disorder, but the underlying emotion is different. The underlying emotion isn't anxiety, it isn't fear. Those dogs often experience a lot of frustration because of just how big everything is. Those emotions are big because those stress levels are high. And so, yes, when we're talking about hyperarousal, particularly in my work where I work with dysregulated dogs, we're referring to dogs who are baselining higher than ideal, and that underlying emotion is sort of not separate, but separate from the stress. And so you can have any number of emotions driving that stress, that higher stress. Anytime we're seeing hyperarousal, I want to investigate pain. Certainly, pain can present as hyperarousal, which is counterintuitive to what we often think. But we tend to think of like pain as dogs like being less active, but many dogs will go really hard at the exercise and activity because exercise can be a good distraction. It releases endorphins, and so some temporary pain relief potentially. But then you have a dog who is hyper aroused, they're not being careful about how they move their body, and they can make things worse. I would also want to look at sleep, particularly if I'm seeing hyperarousal as kind of like a general theme. Again, being sleep deprived, same sort of thing, can look like a big excitement. It can look like hyperarousal, but it's actually like sleep deprivation. And so I would want to be looking at that. Our adolescent dogs up through adolescence, and then again in seniorhood, 18 to 20 hours a day. Adult dogs, 12 to 14 hours a day. And I would want to look at the quality of sleep. So in a lot of cases, and with hyperarousal, I want to look at how is the sleep, how are there any underlying health issues that could be driving this as well. But the short answer is yes, stress definitely includes hyperarousal. There can be, as I said, any number of underlying emotions driving that stress. When we look at that stress scale, we're not really considering emotion, although emotion is important to the work, but we're not really considering emotion on the stress scale as much as just the stress itself, which can be driven by any number of emotions.